This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Today in the show, I have Robin Hanson. Robin is a professor of economics at George Mason University, my alma mater. He's also an expert on idea futures, prediction markets. One very interesting guest. I hope you enjoy.
I'm in Burke, Virginia.
You're in Burke.
Just south of Fairfax.
Cool.
That's where I live. So I have a short commute to George Mason where I work. Just a 10-minute drive.
I used to commute from Vienna to George Mason back in a long time ago. So I know something about commuting to George Mason. But that school, it keeps changing, though. I'll tell you what, boy, they put a lot of money into that over the years. Wow.
Yeah, it's a big school now.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay, so listen, here's where I want to jump in. I don't know if you know much about my world, except being kind enough to appear in my podcast, but
I could use an intro.
Yeah, so I've written 5 books, and it's about a particular style of quantitative trading, typically employed on futures markets. And essentially the premise is you really don't know what's going to happen. So the best you can do is follow along with what's going on right now. So of course you can see,
What does that mean?
You can see the immediate dovetail, without me giving you too much. It dovetails right into your world. So I want you to define for me prediction markets, because I'm thinking in my own mind that prediction markets are essentially futures markets on non-financials, non-commodities, whether they be ideas or political races.
Sure.
Am I barking up the right tree?
Sure. I've got a standard spiel on this.
Oh, give me the standard. Come on. You can even add something beyond standard.
Okay. So prediction markets are using the exact same mechanisms of standard speculative markets, such as stock markets, commodity markets, options, that sort of thing. The mechanisms aren't very different. The difference is the customer. Who is buying what? In most financial markets, the main customer is the trader, who often wants to hedge risk and then often wants to speculate to take advantage of the others who are hedging risk. And as a side effect, most speculative markets create information and aggregate information, and you can watch the markets to get information, but the people who are watching to get information are not the customer. They're not the reason the market exists. They aren't the reason why some things are traded more than others, and they don't influence the structure of it much. Prediction markets are the same product with a different customer. Prediction markets, in my mind at least, are where somebody wants to know something badly enough to create markets on a subject of interest to them, and even to subsidize those markets to get more people to pay attention to them.
Okay, but there are some prediction markets where people want to apply capital to them. I mean, there's some people that want to bet on the prediction markets in your world. It's not just only the customer, right?
Right, but for every market, there is the customers, people who are buying, and then there are the suppliers, the ones who are selling. And in a prediction market, the sellers are the ones with information, and the buyers are the ones who want information. And so if the buyer sets up a prediction market and subsidizes it on a topic they are interested in, then that should induce sellers, people with information, to come trade in those markets to reveal their information.
Okay, Robin, give a good example. Pick a political way of using prediction markets and explain to the audience how this might unfold, if they're still not envisioning it yet, how it might unfold.
So the simplest concrete example might be if you were a firm and you had a project, you were opening a store, you were building a product, and there's some uncertainty about when you're going to be ready. You'd like to coordinate marketing and distribution to be matching when your product is ready, but you're not sure if it is going to be ready when some people say it is. So you could set up a betting market on the subject. Will we make this deadline, or when will this product be ready? And you could invite your employees and contractors and associates to participate in that betting market. And as a result, you could get reliable estimates about whether you'll make your established deadline, and if not, when it would actually be ready. In order to do that, you'll have to set up the market, because it's not going to exist unless you do so. Ordinary speculators aren't especially interested in when your store is going to be open. But if you put some money on the line and even subsidize the markets, you may well get people that come trade in that market to tell you, is your store going to be open on time?
So at any given point in time, the price of whatever event or issue that's being speculated on, hedged, whatnot, in a prediction market, that particular price is viewed as the most accurate representation of the issue at hand. I mean, the audience, the crowd itself, I'm barking up the right tree, I assume?
Right. So if you create an asset that says pays $100 if we open the store on time, and you let people trade that asset, and it turns out the current price is 60 cents on the dollar, if it pays $10 if it's open, then its price is $6. Then that gives you a rough estimate that there's a 60% chance that your store will be open on time.
It's essentially going for the wisdom of crowds. It's instead of just one particular opinion.
Well, it's the wisdom of whoever you get to participate in the market. So you aren't especially eager to get ignorant amateurs to participate. If you are trying to buy information, you're trying to buy it from the most reliable and cheapest source. So you would like the people who actually know if the store will be open on time to participate. And that may be people you already have some sort of organizational relationship with, but they may lie to you through those other channels. They may tell you the store will be open on time, but they don't really believe it. But how are you going to find out unless you give them a more clear incentive to be honest?
Let me bring this to financial markets for a second, just so you can make some comparisons. So if I look at the S&P in the last 15 years, we've had some big run-ups and some big run-downs. And generally, most people, many very bright economists that are probably quite famous over the decades, would say, okay, that price, that's the price. That's the everything's reflected in that price. But the reality is we've had some major booms and busts. So when you make the case in the prediction market worlds that you hope that the participants are bright and learned, how do you see that, though, when you look back at financial markets? Because clearly financial markets have boom and bust periods.
So there's two ways to look at any one mechanism for producing estimates. What we want is a institution and a mechanism that will produce accurate estimates we can rely on. And there's two kinds of standards of comparison. One standard of comparison is to the absolute truth. Did it always exactly get the truth right? And in almost any realistic situation, any realistic mechanism will disappoint on that standard. It won't get it exactly right. It will have error. Error is the difference between what it estimated and what the truth was. And that's going to be true for pretty much the foreseeable future. The other kind of standard to impose or to use to evaluate a mechanism is to compare one mechanism to another mechanism. If you compare two imperfect, feasible mechanisms, neither of them will do ideal in terms of having zero error, but one of them might have a lower error than the other. So if we compare financial markets estimates to other institutions that estimate the same thing at the same time, I think you'll find that financial market estimates are consistently as accurate or more accurate than other institutions. So for most of those times in the past when you saw a run up or a run down and you look back and you say, well, I think that was an error, ask yourself, what other institutions in society could you have pointed to that at the time gave a more accurate estimate about the error that was unfolding? There's probably no one. That's the whole thing here. Is there the inability to, I had and I would expect that you probably crossed paths with him at some point in time. But I had Vernon Smith on my podcast, and he, from his perspective, he said, "Look, we've seen these booms and busts, but the one thing we can never really come up with was the why. We couldn't really affix a why to it." The world is a big and complicated place. human minds are small and limited. Live with it. Even millions of human minds working together are still pretty limited compared to the complexity of the world around us. The question is, how can we best deal with that complicated world given our limited abilities? So rather than independently dealing with the complicated world, we want to come together somehow and coordinate together to produce estimates. And speculative markets are basically the best mechanism we have in head-to-head comparisons that simply beats out the alternatives.
Do people want to have you come on TV and be that logical and that coherent with that and express it that way? Do people really want to hear that?
Well, TV is not necessarily about aggregating information into our best estimates about the world. So fundamentally, the most interesting question about prediction markets in my mind is who wants this product and when? So again, the product is a way that you can pay to generate information about the world. There is perhaps some demand for that, but it's actually remarkably small. And we're surrounded by vast medias of newspapers and TV and magazines and blogs and podcasts even. And these media are full of bits flying back and forth. And in some abstract sense, bits represent information. They're information about something, but they aren't very obviously information about the world that we need to practically deal with. There are many other reasons why we might plausibly like all these bits other than wanting accurate estimates. So
as you bring up practicality, I saw a piece that you wrote, a submission recently, maybe just in the last couple of days. Look hard, then steer slightly. Okay, you've got to explain that. I thought it was a great explanation, and it dovetails so nicely into my speculative trading world. And I just thought that was so just simple. But I'm sure the way you explained it, and I want you to explain it, at least the first half with being on the log and the river, that explanation that we can't control a lot around us and that things are going to unfold as they might, that doesn't provide a lot of comfort to some people. Some people are not going to like that explanation.
So this was an essay in response to an essay contest, and the question posed was, how can humanity steer its future? So that's a grand question, and it's the kind of conversation we often have in the media and larger intellectual conversations. We look at the sweep of human history and the potential future sweep, and we ask ourselves, where do we want to go and how should we get there? And that all presumes that we are driving, that we can look ahead and choose among the options we might imagine.
Come on, Robin. Hold on, Robin. But you're saying that assumes we're driving. Everyone thinks they're driving.
Well, you're driving something somewhere to some degree, but the key question is how much. So the analogy I gave in the essay that you were asking about is, imagine you are in a broad, flat, fast river flowing at night, and you hear the roar of rapids ahead. What should you do? If you take the grand steering our future metaphor, you would think about what kind of landscape you'd like there to be a river on, and what kind of river you'd like to have going through that landscape, and should it be wide or deep, and what color should it be? And that's all pretty irrelevant to you in that particular river hearing the rapids ahead. It's not even good enough for you to look at the entire river in front of you and look ahead and say, gee, that spot over there on the right is the best spot, so let me go there. Because if the river's wide and fast enough, you can't go to most of the places you can see. If you actually care about what's about to happen to you when you hit these rapids, you need to be focusing on the part of the river ahead of you that you could actually get to by feasible, modest swimming in one direction or another. Put your attention very carefully on that and look very carefully about what's ahead. Most of the work is looking. Most of the work is trying to see what's up there. Once you figure out that there's a sharp rock a bit off to the left, it's pretty easy to figure out your best strategy is to swim to the right. But you can only swim so fast, so far. So we as humanity can't actually direct the future of humanity in very much detail. I mean, in some abstract sense, the future is a net result of everything we do, but we don't understand most of the consequences of what we do, and we don't coordinate very well. Each of us really is only a tiny part of the world, and each of us only has a tiny fractional influence on the world, and we're pretty ignorant about the effect of what we do on what will happen. So I think if we want to understand how best to steer the future, the most important thing is to try to look very carefully at what's likely to happen if we do absolutely nothing, because honestly, the world is pretty likely to be close to what we would do if we did absolutely nothing. The world we have now, the world you live in, is very close to the world it would have been had people in the past done absolutely nothing to try to influence your world. That is, people in the past did things and they affected what happened, but they didn't do that anticipating the effects and driving them in a foreseen direction. They did things, and a side effect of that was what happened to you. And sometimes they had some imagined hopes for what might happen later, but there was usually a pretty weak connection between what they did and what actually happened.
Now, you've clearly thought this through nicely. And if I was trying to be on the other side, I would just fold my cards and I wouldn't argue, because I'd just be like, oh, shit, this guy's got me beat. I can't really stand up to this description, this argument. However, I'm sure that doesn't stop people from disagreeing with you, from people wanting to take the other side. What kind of reactions do you find from the audience out there, peers, associates, media, when you give something, when you give an explanation like that? Do they just go, "Hey, Robin, that was great," or do they want to kind of like knock you on the head? Or
the usual excuse is, this time it's different, or, this time I'm different, or we're different. Most people are happy to grant that for most times in history and most issues, and for most people, these sorts of descriptions are roughly right, but they're different, or now is different. Good luck with that. I want to
let you circle back to, because you've got I think when people Google you, they're going to find out that and as I originally wrote you, I said, well, we're going to talk about everything in your world. And you're like, well, you might need to narrow it down some, Mike. So you've got some diverse interests. Why don't you explain to me physics background? How did you end up at the place where prediction markets became a passion? How did you, I don't want to say stumble, but how did you work your way into that world?
Okay, so I started out as an undergraduate in engineering because I thought, let's design stuff. Let's make the world a better place. Let's build stuff. And then as I got into engineering classes, they were cookbook. They were recipes. They didn't help me understand. And that bugged me. And I wanted to understand all these theories that were being laid out. So I switched to physics. And even as an undergraduate, the first 2 years of physics were going through all the different areas of physics at an introductory level of detail. And then the next 2 years were going over all the same topics with more math. And that bugged me because I wanted to understand the concepts. So what I did was I ignored the instructions about what homework to do, and I just played with the equations on my own, moved them around, et cetera. And then by doing that, I learned enough to ace the exams, but sometimes professors had to decide what to do with their formula for the grade. When it came time for graduating, I realized that what I most wanted to understand was this whole science thing. So there were all these claims made to undergraduates about how all these powerful things I had learning were the result of some scientific process, and that was a precious thing humanity had developed, and that was the key to understanding, and it was confusing. And I didn't understand, well, how did this work? So I went to grad school in philosophy of science, and I worked through a lot of the puzzles I'd had, and a lot of the sort of things people say that don't make very much sense. And I realized there isn't really something called science. It's just kind of a word for thinking carefully. And that I realized, a key issue was the social organization of academia and science and inquiry. That is, what incentives individuals have to say one thing or say another, to be rewarded or punished for what they contribute. That makes a huge difference to whether the whole enterprise works. And so I got interested in the social institutions of science and academia, and that stayed with me as an interest. And I was puzzling for many years over how could you have a reasonable system that would actually work to induce people to figure things out and contribute them to some common understanding. I eventually got interested in future tech scenario stuff, so I read some exciting articles while I was a grad student, and both things that I was reading about were happening in Silicon Valley. One was artificial intelligence research, the other was hypertext publishing. And so I went off to Silicon Valley to do one as a job and the other as a hobby. And but over time, I hung out with the Xanadu people, who might know they were a precursor to the web. They were working on something like the web before there was a web. And they had this vision of how the web would help the world figure out what's true by making criticism easy to find. So their story was, if you read something in the newspaper or a journal and it was wrong and somebody else knew that it was wrong, you couldn't easily find their critique, their rebuttal. And so with the web, you would be able to easily find rebuttals, and that would make everything work much better. So that was an exciting vision. After a while, I realized, no, that doesn't make that much sense. And then I asked myself, well, what would make sense? And since these people were somewhat rabid libertarians, they had introduced me to the idea of, competitive markets and all the things they could do. And so in my mind, I said, well, what if we just had a betting market on all these important questions? So imagine most of the controversial questions that people discuss and debate that are related to science and technology, and imagine that there were betting markets on these questions. Then, arguably, instead of the loudest person or the most prestigious person winning the debate, or the person who appeals to the audience's ideological presumptions, maybe the winner could be the guy who was most willing to bet because they had the most confidence they were right. So that's the end of so the final point of the story was, I realized that betting markets had the potential to become a robust, reliable institution by which we could all figure out who to believe about what on questions that mattered.
Something about putting your money on the line, taking a stake, creates something emotionally, psychologically, intellectually different than not. Yes?
Well, yes. I mean, the key point is our evolved intuitions for how, and our habits and behavior for when we argue and when we discuss and when we write articles and when we debate, and which things we end up supporting, are all based on very elaborate subconscious strategies by which we figure out who our potential allies are and who our potential rivals are and what would be impressive and which groups, if we join them, they might support us and against our rivals. And it's all very complicated and sophisticated, but it's not necessarily very tuned toward, believing what's true. Because for most of these topics that we talk about abstractly, the truth of them won't actually affect us personally very much. So when we argue about politics or when we argue about cosmology even, we aren't very tuned toward, being accurate. So the question is, how can we be more accurate in a world like that with, our instincts being of that sort? And one very straightforward way is to turn our attention toward the truth by giving us a direct financial payoff if we're right. It's a strong incentive that can make us pay more attention to the truth.
In prepping to speak with you today, I caught a statement by the founder of Wikipedia talking about dispersed knowledge. And I think it led into some discussions as to maybe some of the foundation economic theory for prediction markets. I don't know if you feel this way or not, but correct me if need be. But Hayek and Mises, some of their thinking and their writings early on, I would assume played some role in your thinking, where both of these men were essentially saying that the price that that buyers and sellers could come to had a lot of importance, a lot of meaning.
So when I was studying history of science, I learned that almost all intellectual fields have a quick history they tell. So most classes which introduce a field give you a quick history of the field, and most journal articles give an introduction that tries to give a quick history of the field. And there's lots and lots of amateur histories that are constructed in the process of doing other things. And when you look at professional historians and what they come up with when they study the history of something in detail, it usually doesn't have that much relation to the amateur historian summaries. So I took that as a lesson to not have opinions about history unless I've done the history or read the people who have read it carefully. So what you say about the history of economics and the importance of Hayek and Mises is consistent with what I've heard from amateur historians of the area, but I just have this general rule against forming opinions unless I've read the professional historians. Does that make sense?
But you've dug into works of Hayek and Mises yourself, so
right, but it's not enough. That's not enough. So in most amateur histories, they will name a particular source and credit it, and then if you go look at that source, there will be some things in that source that give some credence to that historical attribution, but you don't know if that's a correct attribution until you've gone and read all the other stuff that was read and written then.
Okay, so I've got a line here that I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. This is from Nate Silver talking about you, and I think this is why I just got spanked, so to speak. So what taboos, ideological beliefs, or misaligned incentives might constrain one from making optimal decisions? And I think you were just nicely giving me an example of that.
Well, like I said, we have rich habits and strategies of conversation in small and large scale that are just not designed primarily to advance the truth. They're designed for all sorts of other things, like supporting your allies. So this habit of in academia of each introductory talk or introduction to a paper giving a quick history is usually designed to sort of support your allies, basically to credit your allies for having been the originators of important and useful things. And that's an important social function that's served in those groups. But if you want to know what actually happened, you have to not take that at face value.
I have a question about prediction markets again. So whatever market is constructed, I'm curious because in my world, people trading futures markets have applied, kind of coming from a Bayesian standpoint, but they applied quantitative models that say, look, if the corn market is going up, I don't know why the corn market is going up, but if it goes up 1%, I'm buying. If it goes up another percent, I'm buying. And you're adding to your position. And you're just going to ride along that trend. And you're going to attempt to make money in the corn market as long as it goes the direction of your initial bet. However, since none of us can really, at least from my perspective in my world, we're not looking at fundamental information. We're strictly treating this as a betting game. You have to stop loss the narrative. So if you're taking that position in corn, it's going up, it goes your way. You've got to always have a stop loss to get out if you lose a certain amount of money, because if you lose all your chips, you can't play the game. So I'm curious in the prediction markets if people have applied particular trading strategies to the markets, or have the trading strategies not really entered the prediction market arena yet, or is it not relevant and I'm confusing something?
It's relevant. It's just a matter of scale. So most financial markets of the sort you are talking about are large and deep and full of activity. And, if we imagine starting from a very small market with a small amount of activity and growing it, the very first traders who trade in a market would be focused on the very simplest things about it. Like, what is this thing I'm buying? What's corn? How is it different from an apple? When is it grown? That sort of thing. And the very simplest markets with a very small number of traders would be focused on the most easy to skim off surface information with hardly any effort. As you add more traders and more activity, that very easy stuff pickings are already taken. You're not going to make money in those markets by doing the easy thing that everybody else is already doing. So you have to dig a little deeper. You have to go into, well, what's happening in this region now, or what's likely to happen over there if this product is introduced. Another way to dig deeper is to look at the patterns of previous activity and find biases, find ways that people consistently make a mistake. And you can, if you find a consistent mistake, then you can fix it and be rewarded for that. And in a world where hardly any people is paying attention to much of what's going on, you can probably find a lot of these biases or patterns that you can use to take advantage. But the more people who are in the market and the more activity, the more people are looking for the easy patterns, and the more those will go away, and you can't make money with those. You'll have to look for subtler ones. And that's the game eventually. So the point is here that prediction markets are usually very small markets. They're usually very, not very much money. They don't last very long. There aren't very many traders. There's not very many trades compared to a stock market or commodity market. So that means you can usually find these patterns much more easily than in the large markets like the corn futures market. So yes, looking for these patterns and taking advantage of them is not only relevant, it's much easier. The downside is that you just don't get paid as much for what you find because there's only so much money in those markets.
I just find it terribly fascinating that, I was not familiar with your work, and I'm glad that I've discovered it, because I feel like you've been working, your life's work has been going, in a way, adding more meat to some of the descriptions that I give about certain trading strategies, because it's the same concept as the log floating down the river. I probably didn't describe that initially the best, but you just don't know what's going to happen. So if you don't know what's going to happen, the best thing you can count on, the most accurate measure is the price right now. And if the price right now happens to be moving up, that might be the best indication that it might continue to move up. And that's all you can really know at this moment in time. And being comfortable with this moment in time, I think, is something that's very difficult for a wide swath of the population.
Well, so, the first thing is the current prices are the consensus of everybody else about the question at hand. And if a lot of people put a lot of work into this, it's probably a pretty good consistent. So you shouldn't take some flip concept off the top of your head and think that that's better than what everybody else is doing. You need to think that you actually do have some insight that's something that the rest of the traders haven't been adding to this market. You should respect that price, and you should ask, what do I know that other people don't? Now,
what if you don't know anything? What if really no one knows anything except that the price is the best estimate?
So if you don't know anything, then you should just take an index fund and walk away. That is, an index fund is just where you invest in everything in same proportion everybody else is, and you ride everybody else's investments, and you don't disagree with them. Now, so that's what you should do unless you are different somehow. One way you could be different is you might have special risk preferences or something, and then you should move your portfolio a bit to adjust for that, but you shouldn't be trading daily or something. You should just adjust your portfolio and then leave it adjusted unless you have to fine tune that adjustment with time. So the only reason you should be doing speculation, i.e. bets, is because you think you're going to beat the other guy at the other end of your bet. Every trade has another party on the other side. You're buying, they're selling. You're selling, they're buying. Sum. So you gotta know you're going head to head with that other guy. And are you better than them is your key question. So, there's a standard story about poker. You look around the table, look for the fool. If you don't see him, he's you. You should walk away.
Yeah.
That's what these markets are like. So you have to know who else is trading in these markets. There are very large, very sophisticated organizations, hedge funds, etc., that are paying a lot of very close attention to these things, and they're trading one way or the other, and that's who you're up against. Now, you could beat them if you have something they don't have, but you gotta think there is something you have they don't have. Now, and one thing everybody can see is whether the price is going up or down. So, I gotta say, it's pretty unlikely everybody else is not already taking into account the fact that the price is going up or down. That seems a really unlikely theory, that you're the guy who says, gee, the price went up. Nobody else is paying attention to that one. Why don't I pay attention to that?
The only thing I would add to that, though, is that sometimes that if you take the position of like, hey, the price is going up and everyone's riding the price up, I think the vast majority of participants, for example, if we look at the U.S. equity markets right now, don't have a stop loss. So they're essentially buying and holding it. And if the S&P goes from where it's at today and retraces 50%, they'll lose 50% of their money because they don't have a stop loss. So I have seen quite a bit of evidence that the idea of stop lossing that narrative makes a lot of sense. And that's one way to differentiate. Now, that'd be a much longer conversation, but that's one way to differentiate.
So a stop loss, we can see it two ways. We can see it as information, or we can see it as risk preference. So as risk preference, we might say, I can't take as much risk as these other people. There's other people in the market, and if it went really south, they could handle it better than me. So I'm going to sell them the risk, and I'll buy insurance. And so if you put in a put to ensure that if the price goes below a threshold that you're out, that's your buying insurance. That insurance comes at a price, and people on the other side will charge you a price for that insurance, and they will get the higher returns that go with higher risk on average overall. But if they can handle risk better than you can, that's the right move for you. The other reason you might want to stop loss is that you just have information that's different than other people about the likely distribution of events. But that seems unlikely in the scenario we're talking about. If the argument is just, hey, other people don't realize, hey, the price can fall as well as rise. You should watch out for that. Then it's a wise, and if your risk tolerance is just less than the average trader out there, then you should express that by being more careful.
Let me shift to two quick things as we wind down. One is kind of fun, one's a little more serious. You were involved in a project a while back, setting up a market to bet on terrorist attacks. And I think it got a little controversy. Why don't you explain what you put together and what happened? What was the result?
Around 2000, the Defense Department had been hearing about prediction markets, and the research arm of the Defense Department, which is DARPA, put out a call for proposals saying, we've heard about prediction markets and how they've worked for other areas. We'd like somebody to show that they work for us, for the problems we're interested in. And I was part of a team that responded to that and was given a grant to show that we could apply prediction markets to intelligence-related topics. And we were focused on combinatorial prediction markets, which is something I've been focused on for a while. And we were ready to go live with a beta site where we were going to have a combinatorial market on events in the Middle East. That is, we were going to be forecasting which country, for a bunch of different countries in the Middle East, which ones were going to have their economy grow, have political unrest, perhaps military relations to each other, and also how all those things related to U.S. policy in terms of grants or military activity. And the result of this market could be that the market could tell you if we increased the money to a particular country or if we did a particular military action, what the consequences that would be for those countries in the area. So it was going to be a market focused on geopolitical stability in the Middle East. When we put this call for participation up on a website where we were saying we're going to have a beta site, would you like to participate? We had some text, and behind the text was a sample screen of what the site might look like. And in that sample screen, we had a bunch of possible topics, like these various countries and these things, as I mentioned. And then we had a miscellaneous section. And in the miscellaneous section, we threw in some other events that didn't fit into the same format as everything else, but that might be relevant for what was happening in the Middle East. And two things in that miscellaneous section were a North Korea missile strike and a assassination of Arafat. Because most of those we thought were plausibly the kind of events that might upset or change other events in the Middle East. On a Monday morning, when the DARPA PR person happened to be out of town, two senators had a press conference where they declared DARPA was having a betting market on terrorist attacks, and that was terrible and immoral and should be shut down. And within a day, the next morning, the Secretary of Defense in front of Congress said, that is terrible and we're shutting it down. Within that day, we weren't asked if the accusations were correct, which they were not. We were not creating a market in terrorist attacks. We were making a market in geopolitical events in the Middle East. But because it was a very tiny project, and the DARPA PR person was out of town, and the politicians correctly, I think, calculated that they were just better off repudiating it than giving any appearance of even defending it or even taking time to think about it. Because there's something of an interesting moral principle that people seem to apply, which is that if something is accused of violating a moral norm, you are supposed to have an instant response. You are not supposed to think about it, because thinking about it gives the impression that you might trade off or consider this violation.
Hey, listen, you're 15 miles outside DC, so you must just have a field day in your world and dreaming up and thinking, because these folks can't handle the type of research and work that you employ. They can't handle this stuff. You know this. Come on. DC politicians, this caused their head to explode.
Well, honestly, very few organizations or people in society are interested in a direct, accurate assessment of sensitive subjects. So I've been trying for a long time to get prediction markets fielded and applied within for-profit organizations and not-profits. And most organizations have a number of important issues central to their profit and bottom line where they are uncertain and where they often have inaccurate estimates, which could be improved by prediction markets, including product delivery dates, sales, things like that. And, such firms could also get even more value out of markets that told them the consequences of different decisions, how the delivery date would change if they changed the product definition or who was in charge of it or things like that. But it's very hard to get any organizations to adopt prediction markets on their questions of immediate importance, because not only are politicians wary of accurate information, so are most organizations, large and small.
It just dovetails into my world, so I just love where you go with everything. I love it. I did not know about your site, and I just love where you're going. I have one last question for you. I'm reading directly from Wikipedia. So this is one of these history sources. These history sources that might not be accurate. So I'm looking at...
Wikipedia is actually a little more accurate than the typical introduction to an article.
So it says, and I don't say this with any kind of... I just am curious to your opinion, and I want to know the background. Robin has elected to have his head cryonically preserved in the event of medical death. So that's one of those sentences that you read and you're like, okay, if I'm interviewing this man, Robin Hanson, that at least if I don't ask him this question, then what kind of an interviewer am I if I don't ask about this situation? Because I have not chosen to do this yet, but I might choose to do it after I listen to your explanation.
Okay, well, yes, I am a customer of cryonics, and the calculation is basically the following. The cost is relatively low relative to the benefit if it worked. So if a typical cost benefit calculation would say that if it has a 5% chance of working, then it's a good enough deal to be worth doing. So that's the threshold that an argument needs to get you above. So I don't need to convince you that it's overwhelmingly likely or even more likely than not, just that it's got a 5% chance. So what's the 5% chance argument? The conventional view that I think I accept and most sort of hard-headed academics accept on two different issues. One is you are a brain, and who you are and all your feelings and all you remember is encoded in your brain. It's encoded in the cells in your brain and the chemical densities in particular parts of those cells and which cells are connected to which other cells. That's one thing that standard academics accept. Another thing that many other standard academics accept is that the world has been improving and growing for a long time. We've been increasing our technical abilities and increasing our economic abilities, and we are just getting more powerful, and that's likely to just continue for a long time into the future. Unless we all destroy ourselves, which would be terrible, but doesn't seem overwhelmingly likely, the world will just get better at lots and lots of things. And so if you let that process play out long enough, we will get good enough to take a frozen brain and look at it in great detail and find the information that's in there about what's connected to what and what the chemical densities are in order to basically find you and bring you back, if they want to. Those two things together would suggest a pretty high chance that unless, civilization is destroyed, that eventually they would be able to bring you back if you froze your brain. The key thing about freezing a brain is once you freeze it, it doesn't change. When you put something in liquid nitrogen, basically it will last for a very, very long time with basically no change. So as long as you think the information's in there and that somebody in the future might want to bother to bring it back, then your main risk is whether you will get to the future by the frozen thing lasting. And in my mind, that's the biggest risk here.
Like the location where your brain would be stored.
Yeah, so typically they put you in a big dewar of liquid nitrogen, and they have to have a building where the dewar is held, and they have to keep topping it off with nitrogen, and they have to not accidentally spill it or destroy it or, et cetera. And honestly, it's just hard to make organizations last over very long time periods and consistently follow a mission without eventually failing. So honestly, that's where I would put most of the risk. But again, I said, you really only need a 5% chance to make it worth the bother. So I think there's a 5% chance that an organization could last long enough to keep this frozen brain into the time period in the future when they'd know enough about how to find you in it.
Hey, just a quick follow-up on that, so I understand the definition here. How would you define medical death?
Death is when you can't live anymore. And if you are just temporarily stopped, you're not dead, you're just stopped. So if you are sleeping or if your brain activity temporarily ceases, you might be, for the moment, inactive, but I'd say you aren't dead if you could be brought back. So in some fundamental sense, death is when your information is destroyed or spread so thoroughly that it's just never going to be feasible to bring you back.
Yeah, that's what I was curious, is that there's a certain types of death. Obviously, if there was a damage and whatnot, your 5% is going to start to drop dramatically. So that's why when I saw the phrase medical death there, I just wasn't really sure if there was more behind it.
I didn't put that phrase in the Wikipedia entry, so.
I did not say you did. I was not accusing you of writing your own Wikipedia biography, okay?
Yeah, that's forbidden. I understand.
Hey, listen, it's really fun talking with you. I enjoy your world, and I'm happy to make your acquaintance. Hey, where's the best place, Robin, for, I'm assuming, overcomingbias.com, but the best place we can send people to check you out, to follow along your world?
Sure. My blog, you can see regular activity, overcomingbias.com. But if you want to just look at my papers and things I've written without following the latest activity, my ordinary website is hanson.gmu.edu.
Cool. Hey, listen, Robin, I appreciate it. Thank you for coming on today, and thank you for steering my podcast world into a direction that it's not yet gone. You're the first person, and I say this affectionately and kind of like this is very cool. You're the first person to bring up the idea of the brain continuing after we're gone and possibly it being brought back. And we didn't even get to the idea of how, sometime in the future we might even theorize how what would they do with the information if they got it off the brain, and where would they put it in? If
this topic just sits in the back of your mind and just bugs you, well, then you can bring me on again.
Hey, Robin, listen, I appreciate it. Take care, and we will talk again hopefully in the future.
Bye.
See you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com, I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.